So it's not exactly ghost ships vanishing off the map. It's actually something closer to ships choosing to go quiet, on purpose, in one of the most watched waterways on Earth, and the ocean itself starting to talk anyway, whether those ships like it or not. Every week right now, tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz are switching off their AIS transponders. That's the system that broadcasts a ship's identity, position, course, and speed to everyone else in the water, and to every tracking service watching from orbit. When it's off, the ship becomes what the industry calls dark. No name, no flag, no course, nothing on the map. And according to maritime tracking firms like Windward, this isn't rare anymore. It's routine in one of the busiest oil corridors on the planet. And it's been getting worse, not better, through this year. Before we get into how that's starting to change, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because this is the kind of story you want to be tracking as it develops, not catching after the fact, once it's already old news. And I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Is any of this affecting fuel prices, insurance costs, or shipping schedules where you are right now? Drop that in the comments, because the ripple effects of this strait staying tense reach a lot further than the Gulf itself. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this, because the geography actually explains almost everything that follows. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there, the open Indian Ocean. Roughly 20% of the world's oil and a large share of its liquefied natural gas moves through this single passage every day. At its narrowest point, the strait is about 33 kilometers wide, but the actual navigable shipping lanes, one inbound and one outbound, are squeezed down to about 3 kilometers each, separated by a buffer zone. That is not a wide open sea lane. That is a corridor narrow enough that a fast patrol boat can cross it in minutes, and narrow enough that Iranian naval and paramilitary forces stationed along the northern shore can watch, intercept, or, during periods of open conflict, mine that corridor with real effect. Understand why ships are going dark in the first place, because it isn't random behavior. Sanctioned tankers, particularly those carrying Iranian or Russian crude, want to avoid being identified and flagged by Western tracking systems, insurers, and enforcement agencies. So the tactic is straightforward. Turn off AIS before entering the strait, run the transit completely dark, and turn the transponder back on somewhere else, often with a destination on record that has nothing to do with where the ship actually went. Windward has documented tankers reporting a declared destination like Karachi on their last known signal, while satellite tracking and radar data show the real route running from Iranian terminals toward Chinese ports. That is not a data glitch or a clerical error. That is a deliberate mismatch between what a ship claims and what it actually does. And it has become common enough that Windward's own analysts describe it as a fleet-wide evasion pattern, not an isolated case involving one rogue operator. On top of the spoofing, there's the human element on the water itself. And this is where the story gets tenser. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps fast attack craft have been running what trackers describe as swarm-style formations near commercial traffic passing through the strait. In one recent collection window, analysts counted roughly 55 small high-speed craft operating across the strait in groups as large as 18 boats, some adopting an escort-like posture alongside commercial tankers, close enough to be read as either protection or intimidation, depending on which side of the relationship you're on. Separately, a stationary cluster of dark tankers anchored west of Larak Island grew from 14 vessels to 18 in a single reporting period, with 6 brand new arrivals showing up with no active transponder signal at all. That anchorage functions as a floating storage and transfer hub, operating almost entirely outside the normal tracking picture, sitting inside one of the most surveilled and most contested waterways on the planet. Here's the thing that should stop you for a second, because it's the actual hinge of this whole story. All of this, the spoofed destinations, the dark transits, the swarm escorts, the anchorage clusters growing month over month, has been happening under a surveillance regime built almost entirely around 2 tools: satellites and radar. Both of those tools share the same fundamental weakness. They depend, in different ways, on the ship's cooperation, or at minimum on the ship being visible from above or catchable in an active radar sweep. Turn off the transponder, and satellite-based tracking services lose the easy identifier that ties a blip on a screen to an actual named vessel with a flag and a history. Sit low in the water at night in a crowded lane full of legitimate traffic, and a radar return starts blending into general maritime clutter, one signature among hundreds. And jam the radar, which is not particularly difficult or expensive with commercially available equipment, and you've blinded the exact system that was supposed to catch you in the act. So for years now, navies, insurers, and maritime intelligence firms have been quietly looking for a layer of detection that doesn't rely on a ship's cooperation and doesn't come from above the water at all. It comes from underneath it. And that's the part of this story most people watching the news out of the Gulf have never actually heard explained properly. Understand the physics here, because this is the part that actually matters, and it's simpler than it sounds. Every ship hull moving through water generates cavitation, which is the formation and collapse of tiny vapor bubbles around a spinning propeller and along parts of the hull as pressure changes rapidly. That process produces sound, and not just generic engine noise the way you might picture it. It's a specific, structured acoustic signature, shaped by the propeller's exact design, the hull's form, how the engine is mounted, and how fast the ship is moving through the water at any given moment. Researchers working with underwater acoustic datasets, including one built from real recordings in the Strait of Georgia using a broadband digital hydrophone, have demonstrated that these signatures are distinct and consistent enough to separate cargo ships, tankers, tugboats, and passenger vessels from one another using sound alone. No visual confirmation needed. The hydrophone used in that particular research operated across a frequency range running from 1 Hz all the way up to 12 kHz, with a dynamic range wide enough to isolate a single vessel's signature out of a genuinely noisy shipping lane full of competing sound sources. This isn't speculative future technology. It's built on decades-old science. NOAA's ocean exploration program has used hydrophones and hydrophone arrays since the Cold War, originally centered around a device called a sonobuoy, dropped from aircraft or ships to listen for enemy submarines moving beneath the surface. The core principle inside a sonobuoy and inside a modern digital hydrophone is the same. A piezoelectric sensor converts pressure changes in the surrounding water into a small electrical signal, and that signal, once amplified and recorded, can be measured with genuine precision. What has changed since the Cold War era is almost entirely the processing layer sitting on top of that old simple sensor. Fiber optic and networked hydrophone arrays can now stream enormous volumes of acoustic data in real time instead of a few hours of tape from a single sonobuoy, and machine learning models can be trained to isolate one specific vessel's engine and propeller signature out of the general noise floor of a crowded, busy strait. Put plainly, the sensor technology required to fingerprint a ship by sound and to pick that one signature out from 100 others moving through the same lane already exists, has already been proven in research settings, and is actively being refined right now. And crucially, it isn't staying inside a lab or an academic paper. In July of this year, a Danish startup called Triton raised a pre-seed funding round of roughly 7.5 million Danish kroner, led by the state investment fund, EIFO, and a firm called the Creator Fund, specifically to deploy low-cost, passive acoustic sensors scattered across the seabed. Their publicly stated primary target is undersea sabotage, catching a diver or a stealth underwater drone approaching the subsea cables that carry roughly 99% of the world's actual internet and data traffic, long before that diver or drone ever reaches the cable itself. But in explaining the size of the surveillance gap they're trying to close, Triton's own team pointed directly at the Strait of Hormuz, explicitly citing the Iranian naval mine activity documented there during this year's Gulf conflict, and at the broader shadow fleet problem of sanctioned tankers running dark through exactly this kind of choke point. The company's founder summed up the underlying blind spot in blunt terms, saying humanity currently has better maps of Mars than it does of its own ocean floor. That's a striking line, and in my opinion, it isn't an exaggeration of the actual gap. It's an accurate description of it. We have surface tracking, we have orbital imaging, and underneath all of that, in the exact corridor 20% of the world's oil depends on, we have almost nothing listening full time. At the same time, and this is worth pausing on. The US Navy has already moved AI-assisted acoustic and sonar detection into fully operational use inside Hormuz itself, though currently aimed at a different threat than tanker identification. Since earlier this year, the Navy has run a partnership with the San Francisco-based analytics firm Domino Data Lab, reportedly valued around $100 million, using AI models to dramatically speed up detection of Iranian naval mines in the Strait. That partnership has reportedly cut mine identification time from a process that used to take months down to a matter of days. The system relies on towed sonar arrays, deployed from uncrewed surface vessels, combining forward-looking sonar to catch moored mines sitting at different depths in the water column, with side-looking sonar to scan the seabed itself for mines resting directly on the bottom. Crucially, this imaging is built entirely from sound, not light, reconstructed from a continuous series of one-dimensional distance measurements as the platform moves forward through the lane, essentially painting a picture of the seafloor from echoes rather than photographs. That specific system was built for mine detection, not for identifying individual sanctioned tankers by their engine signature. But it proves something that matters a great deal for where this story is actually headed. The infrastructure, the funding, and the operational appetite for passive underwater sensing inside this exact strait already exists, is already being tested, and is already running in real time, today, not as a future concept. Let's take a look at how these two threads actually connect, because on their own they're two separate stories, but together they point somewhere specific. On one side, you have a documented, growing shadow fleet problem inside Hormuz, one that satellites and radar are visibly struggling to keep pace with, evidenced by fleet-wide AIS spoofing, dark transits, swarm escorts around commercial traffic, and an anchorage cluster that keeps expanding month over month. On the other side, you have mature and rapidly improving acoustic fingerprinting technology proven in peer-reviewed research, active naval investment in passive underwater sensing inside that exact same waterway through the Navy's mine-hunting partnership, and a funded private company explicitly naming Hormuz as a priority expansion target for exactly this kind of seabed listening array, for a related but distinct security problem. That is not a rumor stitched together from unrelated headlines. That is the direction the actual money, the actual research, and the actual operational deployments are already moving in, and it's documented across independent sources. A commercial maritime tracking firm, a peer-reviewed acoustic dataset built from real hydrophone recordings, a funded startup with a named founder on record, and a currently operating US Navy program with a named contractor and a reported dollar figure attached to it. I want to push on the harder question here, because I think this is exactly where a lot of casual coverage of the Gulf gets it wrong. Most viewers assume the fix for a shadow fleet problem is simply more satellites, better radar coverage, or tougher paper sanctions. Enforcement layered on top of what already exists. In my opinion, as someone who has spent years around maritime logistics and vessel tracking systems, that instinct is aimed at the wrong layer of the problem entirely. Satellites and radar both get defeated by the same basic move: non-cooperation from the ship itself, followed by jamming when non-cooperation alone isn't enough. Passive acoustic sensing defeats a completely different assumption than either of those systems relies on. It does not care whether the ship broadcasts anything at all. It does not care if the radar signal gets jammed into uselessness. A hull moving through water generates sound whether the captain wants it to or not, and that sound carries a signature that is extremely difficult to disguise without physically re-engineering the propeller and the hull itself, which is neither cheap nor quick to do. That's why, in my reading of where this actually goes, the real turning point in Hormuz over the next few years won't be a new satellite constellation or a longer sanctions list published somewhere in Washington or Brussels. It will be exactly what Triton's expansion plans and the Navy's existing mine-hunting partnership are already pointing toward: a seabed that listens continuously instead of a sky that only watches intermittently. Once a passive acoustic array gets purpose-built for the sanctioned tanker problem specifically, rather than for cables or for mines, the Shadow Fleet's current core advantage, invisibility purchased simply through non-cooperation, mostly evaporates. You can switch off a transponder in about 3 seconds. You cannot switch off the sound your own propeller makes cutting through water, not without rebuilding the ship. Before we widen the lens further, understand how we actually got to a fleet running dark at this scale, because it didn't start this year. Sanctions on Iranian crude tightened significantly starting in 2018, and the Shadow Fleet as an organized phenomenon really took shape from there. Initially built around aging tankers nearing the end of their working life, often reflagged multiple times, sometimes insured through obscure regional providers, rather than the major protection and indemnity clubs that cover most of the world's commercial fleet. What changed after Russia's full invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is scale. A shadow fleet that once numbered in the dozens grew into one estimated by some maritime analysts at several hundred vessels globally, absorbing not just Iranian crude, but a large share of Russian oil, moving under a Western price cap it was specifically designed to dodge. Hormuz sits at the center of that expanded network because Iranian crude has to physically pass through it to reach any buyer. There is no alternate route, no pipeline bypass large enough to replace tanker volume at that scale. That's part of why the anchorage west of Larak Island keeps growing instead of shrinking. It's not an anomaly. It's the physical bottleneck where an entire global shadow trade is forced to queue. The market consequences of that queue are not abstract either. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting Hormuz have spiked repeatedly during periods of heightened tension this year, sometimes by several multiples within days of a single incident, which directly raises the cost of every barrel that passes through, cost that eventually reaches a fuel pump or a heating bill somewhere far from the Gulf. Freight rates for legitimate, fully compliant tankers willing to transit the strait have also moved with every escalation, because insurers and charterers are pricing in a real, not theoretical, chance of seizure, collision, or worse. So even setting aside the sanctioned fleet entirely, the mere existence of a growing dark-running population inside the strait raises costs for everyone else moving through the same 3-kilometer lane, compliant or not, because risk models can't always distinguish a legitimate transponder outage from a deliberate one until well after the fact. Let me widen this out for a second, because Hormuz is not actually a one-off case. It's the sharpest current example of a pattern showing up at every major maritime choke point on Earth. The same underlying tension exists in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait near Yemen, where Houthi attacks have already forced large volumes of shipping to reroute entirely around the Cape of Good Hope rather than risk the transit. It shows up in the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia, historically one of the most pirated waterways in the world, and now one of the most AIS spoofed as well. And it shows up in the Panama Canal, where drought-driven transit restrictions have pushed operators toward the same kind of scheduling opacity, if not outright dark running. Every one of these choke points shares the exact same structural weakness that Hormuz has: surface-level tracking that a determined operator can simply switch off, sitting above an ocean floor that almost nobody is listening to full-time. Whichever government or company solves that gap first, and does it cheaply enough to scale across multiple straits rather than one, ends up holding a genuinely significant strategic advantage, not just over sanctioned tankers, but over anyone trying to move anything quietly through water that the rest of the world depends on. There's another layer to how this evasion actually works on the water, and it's worth walking through because it explains why a purely visual or radar-based fix was never going to be enough on its own. A large share of dark transits don't just involve one ship disappearing and reappearing somewhere else. They involve ship-to-ship transfers, where a sanctioned tanker meets a second vessel, often further out at sea near the northern reaches of the strait or just beyond it, and physically pumps its cargo across at anchor or drifting slowly, sometimes over many hours. The receiving vessel then carries a cargo with a laundered paper trail, no longer directly traceable back to the original sanctioned tanker's last confirmed port of loading. Windward's reporting on the northern part of the strait has specifically flagged a rise in these ship-to-ship transfers as part of the same broader dark pattern, and it's a maneuver that is almost impossible to catch from a satellite pass alone, since both vessels can simply look like two ordinary tankers sitting near each other for a few hours in busy, already crowded waters. A passive acoustic array, by contrast, doesn't need to interpret two blips near each other and guess at intent. It can log two distinct acoustic signatures present in the same location for an extended, unusual dwell time, which is exactly the kind of behavioral pattern that's difficult to fake and easy to flag once you're actually listening continuously instead of checking in periodically from orbit. It's also worth being honest about where this technology still falls short, because I don't think a serious channel does this topic justice by pretending the seabed listening solution is already finished and deployed at scale. Triton's own funding round announced in July is a pre-seed round, the earliest stage of startup financing, meaning full deployment across a strait the size of Hormuz is still years away, not months. The Navy's mine hunting partnership, while operational, is tuned specifically for mine signatures sitting on or near the seabed, a different acoustic problem than tracking a moving vessel's engine signature in real time across a busy lane. And background noise in Hormuz itself is a genuine technical obstacle, given how much commercial and military traffic already moves through that same corridor daily, all of it generating overlapping acoustic signatures that any system has to separate cleanly enough to act on with confidence. None of that undermines the direction this is heading in. It just means the honest timeline is measured in years of steady deployment, not a switch that flips overnight. There's a real governance question buried inside all of this too, and it's worth naming directly instead of glossing over it. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, ships generally retain a right of transit passage through international straits like Hormuz, even military vessels, even during periods of tension, so long as that passage is continuous and expeditious rather than threatening. A passive acoustic network built to identify and flag sanctioned tankers moving through international waters sits in a genuinely gray legal zone. It isn't stopping a ship's transit passage. It's simply removing the anonymity a ship might have been counting on to make that transit undetected. That distinction matters enormously to insurers deciding whether to cover a voyage, to banks deciding whether to finance a cargo, and to governments deciding whether to authorize an intercept once a ship's real identity gets confirmed by sound rather than by a spoofed AIS broadcast. One more angle worth understanding before we get to the close, because it's the piece that actually connects this back to your own life if you're nowhere near the Gulf. When a tanker goes dark in Hormuz and its true cargo, origin, or destination can't be confirmed, that uncertainty doesn't just sit with the shipping company. It gets priced into every downstream contract touching that barrel of oil, from the refinery buying it, to the trading desk hedging against it, to the fuel distributor setting a regional price weeks later. Multiply that uncertainty across a fleet that maritime analysts estimate now runs into the several hundreds of vessels globally, moving a meaningful share of the world's traded crude, and you get a persistent structural risk premium sitting quietly inside global energy prices, one that most people paying for fuel never connect back to a specific anchorage west of a small island in the Persian Gulf. Solving the identification problem at the source, cheaply and continuously, doesn't just help enforce sanctions. It removes a real cost that's currently being passed along the entire chain, all the way down to a gas station a long way from Hormuz. Now, here's a question worth actually sitting with for a moment, because there are two real, defensible sides to it, and I don't think the answer is obvious. If a passive acoustic network like this eventually gets built and deployed specifically to track sanctioned tankers by their acoustic signature, who should actually control it? Should that authority sit with the coastal states directly, Iran and Oman, who border the strait and arguably hold the strongest sovereign claim to monitor traffic in their own adjacent waters? Or should it sit with an international or US-led coalition effort, given that roughly 20% of the world's oil supply and the economic interests of dozens of countries that have nothing to do with the Gulf directly depend on that strait staying open, stable, and genuinely monitored? Tell me which side you land on, and more importantly, tell me why, because I think the honest answer here says more about how you view sovereignty over shared waterways than it does about the technology itself. Until the next episode, if you found this useful, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you don't miss the next update as this actually develops, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and share this with anyone who follows shipping, energy markets, or Gulf security closely, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets confirmed quietly in a trade publication months before it ever hits mainstream news.